Kevin Levrone at his absolute best. Quite possibly the greatest physique of his entire career. It looked like this was finally the year he would become Mr. Olympia. What? This can't be happening. Kevin Levrone loses to the champion once again? And once again he finishes in second place. This is unbelievable. How could this possibly happen?
When the name Kevin Levrone is mentioned in the world of bodybuilding, almost everyone remembers the same phrase: the greatest bodybuilder who never became Mr. Olympia. And it remains one of the most heartbreaking stories in the history of professional sports. Because this isn't the story of a man who lacked talent, nor is it the story of an athlete who simply got lucky enough to compete among the best. This is the story of a man who proved time and time again that he was capable of defeating almost anyone. Yet every single time he stood just one step away from the greatest title in bodybuilding, something happened that changed everything. That's why fans still ask the same question today. What really kept Kevin Levrone from becoming Mr. Olympia? Was it genetics? Bad timing? Or was he simply unfortunate enough to compete in the era of one extraordinary champion? To answer that question, we have to go back, long before the world knew the name Kevin Levrone. His journey was anything but easy. As a child, he experienced a tragedy that could have broken almost anyone. Within just a few years, Kevin lost both of his parents. He was left alone at a very young age. That was the moment he learned one simple truth. No one was going to hand him anything in life. Everything would have to be earned. At first, bodybuilding wasn't a dream. It was an escape, a way to cope with pain. Every workout distracted him from memories he couldn't erase. Every extra pound on the bar became another small victory over himself. Then something happened that nobody expected. The young man who had walked into the gym simply to survive one of the darkest periods of his life turned out to possess extraordinary genetics. His muscles grew at an unbelievable rate. His shoulders became wider. His arms grew larger. His back developed the kind of shape that thousands of bodybuilders spend their entire lives chasing. But what amazed people most was something else. Levrone looked as if his body didn't even understand the meaning of limits. Even experienced competitors admitted that genetics like his were incredibly rare. Before long, amateur competitions stopped being a real challenge. He kept winning, again and again. With every new victory, experts became more convinced of one thing. They were witnessing the rise of a future bodybuilding superstar. When Kevin earned his IFBB Pro card, many people were already saying that the sport had just welcomed a man who was destined to become Mr. Olympia. The incredible part? Nobody thought that prediction was exaggerated, because Kevin seemed to have everything. Phenomenal genetics, extraordinary symmetry, massive muscle size, natural charisma, and an almost unbelievable ability to transform his physique in just a few months, a level of conditioning that took most athletes years to achieve. At that point, the question was no longer if Kevin Levrone would become Mr. Olympia. There was only one question left: when would it finally happen? But no one could have imagined the greatest obstacle waiting ahead. It wasn't injuries, it wasn't age, it wasn't even his own mistakes. It was another man. A man who would change bodybuilding forever. And because of him, Kevin Levrone's name would forever become a symbol of greatness without the one title that mattered most. The moment Kevin Levrone first stepped onto the Mr. Olympia stage, one thing became obvious. The audience wasn't looking at just another contender. They were looking at a man who had everything it took to become the new face of bodybuilding. He possessed a combination of qualities that only a handful of athletes are ever born with. Massive, perfectly rounded shoulders, incredibly powerful arms, a thick, deeply detailed chest, and an aesthetic physique that never disappeared no matter how much muscle he added. On stage, Levrone looked like a real-life superhero. But there was one problem. At the very same time, another man was walking onto that stage, Dorian Yates. They called him the Shadow, and no nickname could have been more fitting. While most bodybuilders were trying to build beautiful physiques, Yates was creating something entirely different, a monster. He changed the philosophy of bodybuilding forever. After Dorian arrived, judges began looking at the ideal physique in a completely different way. Aesthetics alone were no longer enough. The champion had to be bigger, denser, harder, more detailed than anyone else, and no one embodied those standards better than Dorian Yates. Every time Kevin stepped onto the stage, he looked incredible. But then Yates stood beside him, and suddenly it seemed impossible for the human body to become any larger. It was an era in which finishing second often meant losing to the greatest bodybuilder of your generation. But the most unbelievable part came later. When Dorian Yates retired, fans around the world believed Kevin's moment had finally arrived. For years, Kevin had remained one of the best bodybuilders on the planet. He had the experience, he had the physique, he had the hunger. It finally seemed as though fate was ready to reward him. Instead, fate dealt him another cruel hand. A new champion emerged, Ronnie Coleman. A man who forever redefined what the human body was capable of becoming. If Dorian was a monster, Ronnie looked almost superhuman. His size appeared unreal, yet somehow he maintained extraordinary conditioning, symmetry, and muscle detail at the same time. Once again, Kevin found himself in a familiar position, good enough to defeat almost any bodybuilder in history, just not the man standing next to him. Over the course of his career, Kevin Levrone finished second at Mr. Olympia 4 different times. For most athletes, that would be an incredible achievement. For Kevin, it became a lifelong heartbreak. Because second place means only one thing. You came closer than almost anyone else, but you still fell short. And the more it happened, the more it felt as though fate itself was playing a cruel game with him. In almost any other era, Kevin Levrone might have won multiple Mr. Olympia titles. Instead, he found himself competing during the reign of 2 of the greatest champions bodybuilding has ever seen. Perhaps that was the greatest misfortune of his entire career. But if dominant rivals were only the reason Kevin never became Mr. Olympia, his story would never have become so legendary. Because there was something else, one unique trait that belonged to Levrone himself, a trait that bodybuilding fans still debate to this very day. And perhaps that was the one thing that ultimately cost him the title he spent his entire career chasing.
There's one detail that people rarely mention when they talk about Kevin Levrone's career. And perhaps it was the very thing that kept him from becoming Mr. Olympia. Unlike most of his rivals, Levrone never lived the bodybuilding lifestyle year-round. Many professional bodybuilders maintained their massive physiques almost every day of the year. They never allowed themselves to drift too far away from contest shape. Kevin did the exact opposite. Once the competition season ended, he often lost dozens of pounds. Sometimes people who happened to see him in public couldn't believe they were looking at one of the greatest bodybuilders in the world. He looked like an ordinary athletic man, Then, something incredible would happen. Within just a few months, Kevin would transform back into one of the most terrifying physiques ever seen on a bodybuilding stage. For most athletes, something like that would be impossible. But Levrone's body seemed to follow its own rules. That's why many people still consider him one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders in history. But that extraordinary gift came with a price. While other competitors spent the entire year refining their physiques, Kevin had to rebuild his body almost from scratch before every season. It was an enormous gamble. Sometimes everything came together perfectly. Other times, there simply wasn't enough time. That is why many bodybuilding experts still believe that if Kevin had stayed in contest shape throughout the year, his chances of winning Mr. Olympia would have been much higher. But there was another reason. Levrone never seemed like a man obsessed with only one goal. Outside of bodybuilding, he had other passions: music, later acting, business, new opportunities. He wanted to live a full life, not spend every single day thinking only about the next competition. Some people believe that decision made him happier. Others believe it cost him the greatest title in bodybuilding. And perhaps both opinions are true, because no one can know what Kevin Levrone might have become if he had devoted every moment of his life to bodybuilding alone. But there is one fact that cannot be argued. Even without a Mr. Olympia title, Kevin Levrone won more than 20 professional competitions and became one of the most respected names the sport has ever known. Even decades later, young athletes still study his posing routines. His physique is still regarded as one of the greatest examples of aesthetics in bodybuilding history. And his name continues to command respect even from people who never had the chance to watch him compete live. Ironically, it may have been the absence of the Sandow Trophy that made him a true legend. Because fans don't remember only the champions who always won. They also remember those who refused to stop fighting. Kevin Levrone's story is not the story of a man who failed. It is the story of someone who was great enough to leave a permanent mark on bodybuilding, yet remained just one step away from officially becoming the best in the world. And perhaps that is exactly why people still talk about him today. Not as the man who lost, but as the legend who came closer than almost anyone else, yet never got to wear the crown of Mr. Olympia.